all of the tragedies that have happened at rock shows since then, that still is one of the most shocking events that's ever happened.
This is the Rock and Roll Twilight Zone with Richard Serrett. Heard exclusively on the Jericho Network in partnership with Westwood One. Unearthing the biggest stories from the history of rock. Exposing the truth and the tragedy. The stories behind rock's immortals. The Rock and Roll Twilight Zone. What might happen is that we blow your mind. Here's your host, Richard Serrett.
For 4 days in August of 1969, the hippie counterculture had showed the world that 500,000 mostly young people could gather in a spirit of peace and love, good vibes, and great music. The Woodstock Arts and Music Festival lineup featured a who's who of rock acts. 10 years after, the band, Canned Heat, The Who, CCR, Janis Joplin, Sly and the Family Stone, Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young, Joe Cocker, The Grateful Dead, Jimi Hendrix, and more. The event wasn't even held in Woodstock. Organizers couldn't find a suitable venue, so they moved it to a 600-acre dairy farm 50 miles away. It wasn't even planned as a free concert. But when 50,000 concert-goers crashed the event 2 days early without paying, and with no security fences erected, organizers had no choice but to let everyone in for free. The event had its problems. 2 people died, one from a drug overdose. There wasn't sufficient food, water, medicine, and not nearly enough portable washrooms. And the weather. There was so much rain over the 4 days the grounds were turned into a teeming, squalid, soggy mess. Despite all this, there was little to no violence. The young people came together, danced, made love, smoked pot, dropped acid, tripped out to the music, and got along. Later, the term Woodstock Nation would be used as a general term to describe the youth counterculture of the 1960s. 6 months later, members of Jefferson Airplane and the Grateful Dead decided to try their hand at staging a free rock concert on the West Coast. It was originally planned for either Golden Gate Park in San Francisco or the San Jose State University practice field. The Rolling Stones' Mick Jagger had actually provided the impetus for the event. The Stones were winding down their hugely successful North American tour, but were stung by harsh criticism of high ticket prices. So, Jagger suggested they cap their tour with a free concert in San Francisco. The live outdoor event would also provide a fantastic backdrop for a documentary concert film being produced by the Maysles brothers, Albert and David, who had begun shooting at the Stones concert in Madison Square Garden in New York in November. The event, Woodstock West as it was being called in some circles, was beset with problems from the get-go. They had to move locations several times before finally settling on a ramshackle, broken-down racetrack an hour and a half east of San Francisco. The decision to hold the event at the Altamont Speedway, combined with several other ill-conceived ideas, would culminate in disaster. By the time the concert ended on December 6, 1969, 4 people were dead. One in a vicious attack by a member of the notorious Hells Angels motorcycle gang, who had been hired to provide security. The free concert would go down as Woodstock's perverted twin. When the Rock and Roll Twilight Zone continues, a free concert at the Altamont Speedway in Northern California turns into rock's darkest day.
Welcome back to the Rock and Roll Twilight Zone. Here's Richard Serrett.
On this episode of the Rock and Roll Twilight Zone, we're exploring the tragedy and mayhem at the Altamont concert, December 6th, 1969.
Woodstock was perceived as this giant triumph, this extraordinary emergence of a peaceful and and coexisting underground culture. And Altamont was seen as the violent destruction of the same thing, kind of a yin and yang.
The end of the innocence moment. The moment when the promise of the 60s came to an end and chaos descended, in the form of the Hells Angels and bad drugs and bad vibes.
Altamont turned out badly. I mean, it was a tragic incident, but in no way, in my mind, is that the end of the counterculture movement or the end of the social experiment the hippies were working on. So I would say, although Altamont was tragic, it is blown way out of proportion.
That's rock journalist Peter Wendel, founder of songmango.com. Although the Woodstock Arts and Music Festival had its own problems, there were gate crashers, there was bad acid, 2 people died, 1 from a drug overdose. Most of that was glossed over in the press. The perception of Woodstock as a peaceful hippie utopia was bound to spawn imitators. Joel Selvin is the former pop music critic for the San Francisco Chronicle and the author of Altamont, The Rolling Stones, The Hells Angels, and the inside story of rock's darkest day.
The Woodstock thing had been greeted with so much press. It really had just dominated the cultural thinking over the course of the fall. And in fact, Altamont was kind of born out of that whole Woodstock myth that we can just set this up on a hillside and have 500,000 people come and we'll all groove and get along together. It'll be great.
It's this sort of scary, sexy symbol of rock at its most dangerous. You don't really want to glamorize it because people got hurt and in some cases people got killed, but it really is this sort of signifier of how a rock show can go bad and yet at the same time be incredibly exciting.
The impetus for the free concert in San Francisco that would become the Altamont tragedy begins in November of 1969. The Rolling Stones were touring the United States for the first time since 1966, and without their founder, Brian Jones, who died under mysterious circumstances the previous July. Instead of performing in small and medium-sized venues to audiences of screaming girls, the band was playing to sold-out arenas with more mature crowds that were ready to listen to the music. Joel Selvin.
When the Stones came to America in 1969 for this tour that culminated in Altamont, they were flat broke, and this was a money run in America. The tickets were about twice as much as any other rock concert had ever been. The deals with the promoters called for 50% in advance because they didn't have the money to finance the tour. They had to get the promoters to finance the tour. So when they got here and found that the whole thing was successful beyond their wildest imaginations and America was just laying down and rolling over for them, they started to think about this free concert at the end of the tour as a kind of mini Woodstock that they could star in. And then through the tour, this idea developed, and at a very late stage, they said, well, why don't we make a movie?
They were feeling bad about being criticized for their high ticket prices. They were also trying to chase the Beatles down in terms of popularity and in terms of spreading the gospel to America. So they were very anxious to make a good impression here in the States, and a free concert was a great way to do it. And they were kind of rushing because they did want to make an impact that would help them increase their visibility kind of in the shadow of Woodstock, where the Stones did not play. So they were definitely incentivized to curry favor with the fans with providing a free concert and also doing it relatively quickly so that they could compete with the release of the Woodstock movie.
Well, there was a movie being made of this tour by the Maisel brothers, who had shot footage of the Stones performing at Madison Square Garden earlier in the tour, and that's also the performance that eventually became the live album Get Your Ya-Ya's Out. The Maisel brothers also filmed the Stones recording Brown Sugar and Wild Horses down at Muscle Shoals down in Alabama. So I'm sure that in the original conception of the film that this free concert at Altamont was going to be sort of the grand climax of the film, that this would be the feel-good payoff of whatever this movie would end up being.
That's Steve Hyden, music critic and the author of Twilight of the Gods. The story of how the free concert ended up being held at the Altamont Speedway, about an hour and a half east of San Francisco, is long and somewhat complicated. By November, the Grateful Dead had everything lined up to hold the concert at beautiful Golden Gate Park, including getting the necessary permits. By 1969, Garcia and the band were old hands at organizing concerts. Then, enter the Rolling Stones touring execs who decided they should be in charge. According to Joel Selvin, the Stones execs were inexperienced and had only just then entered the rock world. Instead of going through back channels, the inexperienced Stones crew went straight to the mayor of San Francisco, who was no fan of the hippie movement. He scotched the idea immediately. The next day, fresh off their Madison Square Garden concert, Jagger announced to the world there would be a free concert in San Francisco, but he wasn't sure where. With about 5 days left before the announced concert day, production staff with the Stones and the Grateful Dead were scrambling. They located a racetrack in Sonoma, about 60 miles north of San Francisco. It was ideal. A nice piece of flat land, lots of parking, infrastructure, highway access. A deal was struck on the spot. By Wednesday, they started sending in equipment to the Sears Point Raceway. However, a dispute with Sears Point's corporate owner, Filmways Inc., arose over a $300,000 upfront cash deposit from the Rolling Stones and the film distribution rights, so the festival was moved once again. On the Thursday before the concert, and still no location, Ted Carter, a local businessman and owner of another racetrack, approached the organizers and offered up his property at no charge. He only wanted the publicity for his broke-down little racetrack. Joel Selvin.
This is a dumpy little third-rate track, barely qualifying for NASCAR status. Biggest audience had ever been there was 6,000 people for a demolition derby. And they don't know what the heck to do, but they dispatched a helicopter with Rock Scully, the Grateful Dead's manager, and Michael Lang, the producer of Woodstock, who's flown out here the day before just sort of to see what's going on and lend a hand, sprinkle some Woodstock fairy dust over this thing. And they go over there in this, radio station traffic helicopter. And Rock says they get over the hill and they come down to where the concert site is supposed to be. And all he sees is oil stains and broken glasses and a couple hundred battered, demolished cars. And he thinks this place looks like hell. And he's just sitting there taking this in when Michael Lang speaks up. And what Rock Scully hears Michael Lang say is, "This is perfect. We can do it here." And Scully, he's going, well, this is the guy who did Woodstock. Okay. So that's Thursday afternoon. Friday morning, they start moving the gear from Sonoma to Altamont. They go on the radio and ask people with trucks to come and help. They use the helicopters to ferry big pieces of gear over. They don't get all the gear. They don't get the lights that go on in front, and that becomes crucial as the night goes on. And they don't get all the steel, so they can't build a very tall stage. They're going to only build a stage that's about 3 or 4 feet tall. That's also going to be a crucial issue. And somehow they managed to build that stage and put that sound system together in the dark overnight, and we're still wrapping cables and plugging in the sound system when Santana started at noon the next day.
When you watch the movie, one of the most incredible things about the show at Altamont is the level of the stage and the fact that there really is no separation between the bands and the audience. It was very easy for people to get on stage, which only, I think, probably exacerbated the response of the Hells Angels, because there really was a need for someone to step in and to keep people away from the performers. However, when you have a security force that has been drinking and taking LSD all day long and is already ill-tempered to begin with, it's not really a good combination. And they were being provoked by the audience, and it was like a perfect storm.
they should have played at Sears Point, and everything would have gone much, much better, because the setup just would have been much less conducive to violence. The Hells Angels would not have had to surround the stage, because they would have been high on a hill, and the crowd would have been, pressure would have been back down the hill, away from the stage, instead of people facing down the slope toward a really low-lying stage.
If the poor location hadn't sealed the concert's fate, the next series of decisions certainly did. The counterculture in California, particularly in the Bay Area, had an affinity for the Hells Angels. The San Francisco chapter had worked security for the Grateful Dead previously, and virtually without incident. But this time would be different. When the Rock and Roll Twilight Zone continues, one bad decision leads to another and seals the fate of rock's darkest day.
Welcome back to the Rock and Roll Twilight Zone. Welcome back to the Rock and Roll Twilight Zone. And Richard Serrett's wearing Spanx to keep his gut in. Welcome back to the Rock and Roll Twilight Zone. Here's Richard Serrett.
On this episode of the Rock and Roll Twilight Zone, we're unpacking the tragedy and mayhem that was the Altamont Free Concert. Former San Francisco Chronicle pop music critic Joel Selvin explains how the Hells Angels were hired to provide security.
In the early planning stages, a rather famous meeting took place between representatives of the concert and some highly placed San Francisco Hells Angels. And at that point, the San Francisco chapter agreed to participate in some limited fashion, and the producer of the concert, Sam Cutler of the Rolling Stones, offered to get them $500 worth of free beer. And that became a sort of famous agreement, and over the years, it's taken on a kind of mythic status. But again, like I told you, the San Francisco chapter lost jurisdiction when it moved out of San Francisco. So they were no longer in charge. And nobody was in charge. Every chapter from everywhere had equal status. And San Jose was a brand new chapter. It had been formed that summer after some violent turf war with an opposing gang called the Gypsy Jokers. And the Gypsy Jokers were destroyed by the Hells Angels, and they established a new Hells Angels chapter down there in San Jose in like June, July that summer. So these were like brand new recruits. A lot of them were not even members yet, but were pledges, right? And they were going to act out, to impress the people.
$500 worth of beer, which is in current U.S. dollars, that would have been, I believe, over $3,000. It would have come to about 200 cases of Budweiser, let's say. So it was a lot of beer. The Hells Angels arrived early in the day, early morning, 8:30, 9 o'clock. They were drinking heavily. So by the time Santana took the stage, and Santana was the first act, many of the Hells Angels surrounding the stage were drunk. And they, had parked their bikes close to the stage, and their bikes were being messed with by the fans, and things became increasingly violent as the day progressed.
That things would go south in an awful hurry at Altamont shouldn't have come as a surprise to anyone. On the one hand, you had a crew of several dozen Hells Angels with a penchant for violence and access to all the beer they could drink. On the other, you had 300,000 hippies in attendance, many of whom were dosing. But this wasn't just ordinary LSD. Joel Selvin.
So in 1966, the people that manufactured LSD in San Francisco were missionary zealots, and the chemists went to great lengths to make sure that that product was pure and exquisite and delivered the experience that they wanted. By 1969, 3 years later, the psychedelic world had devolved into a criminal enterprise, and these drugs were no longer being manufactured by such scrupulous chemists. Strychnine, which is a poison, lengthens the experience, gives you a longer trip. Some chemists mixed methamphetamine in with their LSD, which was this particularly dangerous, volatile cocktail that meant for a lot of violent behavior. When we saw tons of that stuff at Altamont, tons. I spoke to the psychiatrists who were working the bummer tent, and they were just astonished at what they saw. And they'd had plenty of experience. They'd come from San Francisco. They'd seen a lot of drug problems, but this stage was catastrophe. And you got to figure from the amount of people they saw and the amount of people that they're out there, that there were literally tens of thousands of people taking LSD that day. I don't think much of it was very good.
Jefferson Airplane's performance marks the moment on that dark day in rock history when the atmosphere of violence that had been brewing ratchets up several notches. During their set, vocalist Marty Balin noticed one of the Hells Angels getting physical with a member of the band's sound crew. Balin intervened. Profanities are exchanged, and Balin is punched in the face and knocked unconscious. The Airplane's Paul Kantner announces to the audience that the Hells Angels have just smashed Marty in the mouth and knocked him out. He then adds sarcastically, "I'd like to thank them for that." At this point, a member of the Angels grabs the microphone from Kantner and issues a vague threat. Word spreads quickly backstage to the other musical performers that the Angels are not only beating up concert-goers, they've started beating on the musicians. The Grateful Dead's Phil Lesh and Jerry Garcia hear about Marty and are dumbfounded.
That's inconceivable to them that would happen. I think, again, because the relationship between the Grateful Dead and the Hells Angels at that time was pretty positive, I think, and that they had always, got along fine, and there probably had never been an indication that, while the Hells Angels may be rough customers, they always seem to be pretty cool around the Grateful Dead. So for that to happen, must have been really shocking.
It was very shocking that they pulled out at the very last minute. But as the story goes, members of the Grateful Dead, Jerry Garcia included, arrived in the middle of the descent into mayhem and chaos. And they grew increasingly concerned, and rightly so, because they were in the area, they were kind of in the backstage area, and they were watching as things got increasingly out of hand. And they were fearing for their safety. And I don't think anybody would blame them for feeling that way.
There's a scene in the movie where Santana drummer Michael Shreve runs into Phil Lesh and Jerry Garcia as they get off the helicopter. Michael's trying to get out of there, and they're just coming in, and he's telling them Hells Angels are beating musicians up, and Jerry says, "Wow, bummer." Jerry is whacked on an Owsley designer psychedelic called STP, but they go backstage and they find out that the Hells Angels have clobbered their number one road crew member, Rex Jackson, who was the lead line of defense on the Grateful Dead. He was a big, huge thug, and the Angels had clobbered him. That meant, oh dear. And then Terry the Tramp, who was a San Francisco chapter member and very close with the band, shows up. This is a Hells Angel whose trademark is he carries a bullwhip with him wherever he goes. And he gets the Dead sequestered backstage and stands with his bullwhip, keeping people away from them, trying to guard them and make sure that nobody messes with them. So they immediately are overwhelmed with the negative energy and the violence and the darkness of the day. And they put themselves, the entire band gets into a little metro van to have an impromptu band meeting to decide what to do. And while they're in there, some Hells Angel that thinks he's funny locks them in so they can't get out. That makes it clear that they don't want to participate in this. So they decide that it's just better if they just go back to San Francisco and, not perform. And that's indeed what they do. So there's 2 hours between the end of the Flying Burrito Brothers and the Rolling Stones. And that's also when sun sets, temperature drops precipitously into the 40s, maybe even high 30s. And the Stones, of course, they're waiting for complete darkness so that they can light up this movie and, be the stars that come out at night while everybody else is filmed in the daylight. Everybody's hungry. Nobody's had water. There were 100 porta potties for some people. By the time the Stones come on at 7 o'clock at night, that is a very uncomfortable, unhappy, edgy, and antagonized crowd.
It was the third song into their set, Sympathy for the Devil, and Hells Angels' Sonny Barger leaps off the stage and wades into the crowd after he notices a concert-goer messing with his motorcycle. Additional angels follow Barger into the crowd and start swinging pool cues. The Stones stop their performance momentarily, and Jagger pleads with the throngs pushing up against the stage to remain calm. The Stones then launch into the next song on their set list. It's during the performance of Under My Thumb that a terrible tragedy begins to unfold. Peter Wendel.
Meredith Hunter was an 18-year-old African-American student, and it's important that he is African-American because of, all the race relations and the racial tension that was going on at that time in the late 60s. And he was there with his white girlfriend, which may or may not have had any impact on what took place, but I do think it's relevant. He was dressed in a bright lime green suit, so he was kind of obvious, and he was very high, and I believe drunk as well, so he was highly intoxicated.
It seems pretty clear that he has a gun in his hand, and there's no way of knowing exactly what he was thinking at the time. I don't know if he felt threatened by the Hells Angels and felt compelled to defend himself, if maybe he was threatening someone else in the crowd, maybe he had a problem with someone else in the audience, or maybe he was just wigged out on whatever.
He approached the stage, I believe, a couple different times, but never brandishing the gun.
Meanwhile, the Maysles brothers are capturing the entire violent confrontation on film.
So there's film footage of Hunter pulling out the gun captured that played a prominent role in the subsequent trial. And you can see he tried to climb up on the front of the stage. An angel had pushed him down. He'd gotten back up in the angel's face. The angel started beating on him. Other angels jumped on him. He was on the ground being kicked and jumped on. He managed to twist and pull away. And he's surrounded by Hell's Angels, and they've been beating him.
He then pulled a .22 out of his waistband and brandished it. He wasn't pointing the gun at anybody. If you watch Jimmy Shelter, the documentary, he was pointing the weapon into the air.
I've never heard anything that has suggested that Meredith Hunter was out to assassinate Mick Jagger or something. I don't get that impression that he was there to harm the band in any way. I think that he made the decision to have a firearm at this show, and he took it out and waved it around people that you don't wave a gun in front of.
He pulled a gun after being beaten by half a dozen or more Hell's Angels trying to get away from him. He pulled out this gun, and as soon as he did, San Jose chapter member Alan Pissarro jumped on Hunter and stabbed him 6 times in the back and neck.
And then other Hells Angels joined in and beat him, kicked him. They were hitting him with pool cues, motorcycle chains, and he died.
It's an amazing episode, and it all happens right in front of Mick Jagger and the Rolling Stones. And they take Hunter's body, people in the crowd, after the Angels relinquish it, and they carry it up to the front of the stage, and they plop it on the stage right in front of Keith Richards' feet. Stones always claim they didn't know what happened, but I tell you, I talked to other people who were on the stage that day, and everybody saw that boy's body being dumped there. So the Hells Angels swarmed over it and pushed it off back into the arms of some guy who carried Hunter backstage all by himself, and he died back there. One of the biggest lies in that movie, which is so famous and up until my book was the only real account of the event, is the shot of Hunter's girlfriend, Patty Bredehoff, crying and being comforted by a Red Cross volunteer as they push the gurney right by her. And the next shot in the movie is a shot of a helicopter taking off. Like, they've lifted Meredith Hunter and they're flying him out, right? Well, they were pushing his gurney to the office where it sat for hours and hours and hours. The coroner would not send out a meat wagon until the traffic died down. He was never helicoptered out of there.
It's like the ultimate sort of exclamation point on the awfulness of that concert, that things got so crazy at the show that, the Stones were playing Under My Thumb at the time, and this guy was murdered within, I don't know how many feet of the stage. I mean, he was not that far from the band when that happened. And just for someone to be killed in such a brutal way is still a shocking thing. I mean, that, for all of the tragedies that have happened at rock shows since then, that still is one of the most shocking events I think that's ever happened.
they say that even if there had been a doctor present or if they had airlifted him out to a hospital, he wouldn't have lived. Anyway, he was too badly beaten. He had been stabbed and he died on the scene. It was a tragic event. It is dangerous for any man to approach a stage with a gun, black, white, or purple. It doesn't matter what your skin color is. That would be considered a clear and present danger. And security, it doesn't matter if it was the Hells Angels or, the LAPD, he would have been taken down. So Alan Pissarro, the Hells Angel that stabbed Meredith Hunter and ultimately killed him, was acquitted on grounds of self-defense because Meredith Hunter had a gun.
Dr. Richard Fine, head of the medical operation that day, he was the first doctor to see him backstage, handed him off and went to try and get permission to medevac. He thought this guy's only hope was medevac, and he was told several times the helicopter was reserved for the Rolling Stones.
When the Rock and Roll Twilight Zone continues, who shoulders the burden of responsibility for the tragedy at Altamont?
Welcome back to the Rock and Roll Twilight Zone. For those of you who don't know, Richard is a bit of a workaholic, and his wife would like him to kind of pull back on late-night interviews with guests. Understandable. And, well, he's sneaking into the studio anyway. He's a bad boy, huh? Richard. Anyways, this is great. I mean, he's gonna do... Oh, it's Richard's wife. And like a little boy, Richard is now in trouble. Welcome back to the Rock and Roll Twilight Zone. Here's Richard Serrett.
Over the years, the Rolling Stones have been criticized for their so-called cavalier attitude towards Meredith Hunter's death. The stabbing and beating took place literally feet from where they were performing. But is it possible they were unaware of what was happening?
From the film is that Jagger did not know that anyone had been killed as they were performing. I mean, I don't know if he found out the next day or what. I mean, in the film, you see him watch the footage of Meredith Hunter being killed, and it's a very chilling moment because his reaction is, I don't know how to classify it. I mean, externally anyway, there is no great expression of sadness or remorse or anger or anything else from him. It's a very sort of almost nonchalant reaction, and that's not to say that he didn't care about it. Only Mick Jagger can answer that question. He's never really talked about it in any real depth. I mean, none of the Stones have. I mean, if you read various Stones books or you read Keith Richards' books, his autobiography, Life, there's not a whole lot of soul searching about Altamont.
The Rolling Stones have never faced up to Altamont in any regard. They didn't pay their hotel bills. They didn't pay their car rental bills. They didn't pay their travel agency. They settled a suit 6 years later. They never contacted Meredith Hunter's family or I think they may have lost one small lawsuit, but they managed to avoid all legal and financial responsibility for this thing at all. And as far as I can tell, and I've done a pretty good amount of research on it, they've never, any one of them, adequately publicly addressed that.
Of course, the Rolling Stones didn't want Altamont to go badly. No one showed up at that concert wanting anybody to be killed. But the Stones, I do think it actually helped their mystique, as sad as that is. I do think it kind of catapulted them into this kind of legendary bad boy status. And Give Me Shelter, the documentary that was released in 1970, definitely fueled that as well. It's a very sensational portrayal of what happened at that concert.
It must be noted that Meredith Hunter was not the only young person to die during the free concert at the Altamont Speedway. 2 concertgoers died in a hit-and-run accident after an attempted car theft, and another young man drowned in a drainage ditch while high on LSD. So who ultimately should be held accountable for these deaths and the disaster that was Altamont? For pop music critic and author Joel Selvin, blame ultimately rests with one individual.
There's a lot of fingerprints on the weapon that made Altamont happen. But there was only one person who really stood back and was responsible for it all, and that's Mick Jagger. All this was being done in the name of the Rolling Stones. I'm clear that the only two Rolling Stones at that time that held any power were Mick Jagger and Keith Richards. I don't think Keith Richards cared one thing whatsoever about this, and it quickly became the entire domain of Mick Jagger, who was, of course, surrounded by other people who also deserve a share of the blame. John James and Ronnie Schneider of the touring company, and Sam Cutler, the stage manager. Don't forget the Grateful Dead's Rock Scully. All these people's fingerprints are on this, and more. But in the long run, it was Mick Jagger who said yes or no to this.
Obviously, the Hells Angels were violent and directly involved in committing a lot of these terrible acts. And then you have the audience, who felt like they could show up and do whatever they wanted. That this was going to be, this utopian place where there were no rules and there were no consequences. Well, that's not the real world. Maybe that worked at Woodstock, but Woodstock is not reality. Like Altamont is reality.
I feel real bad about Meredith Hunter and the way his history treated him and what happened to him and the whole tragedy of his family and his upbringing, his life. And I would have been hoping that the Rolling Stones addressed that to some degree, but they did. But it doesn't make Brown Sugar any less great a rock and roll record, afraid not.
If Woodstock was the counterculture's golden child, Altamont was its stillborn twin brother. The most horribly planned rock festival in history died the moment it was conceived. The bad vibes at the anti-Woodstock were an eerily appropriate backdrop for the Stones' anthem, Sympathy for the Devil. Jagger, the playful Antichrist, teased and taunted the tripping masses with his lewd sneer and cock-of-the-walk gyrations, playing an unwitting ringmaster to the terrible tragedy about to unfold. The stage on which the Stones and the other bands performed was way too low, barely above ground level. That fact alone all but invited the crowd to become unruly and uncontrollable. Add to that mix tens of thousands of people tripping on acid laced with strychnine and methamphetamines. Several dozen motorcycle outlaws spoiling for a fight. If Manson's murderous rampage killed the 60s, Altamont kicked the bloodied and bloated corpse to the curb. Until next time, I'm Richard Serrett. So long for now.